In a minute, if it's okay, I'm going to share my screen. But before I do that, I just want to say that what I'm going to try and do is set out the importance of the fight against the remilitarization of this country, including in terms of its nuclear weapons, but more generally. And I think it's an important fight for this country and for the world. And I'll come on to explain that, I hope usefully. So if it's okay, I'll just start to share my screen. Well, there's the slogan that I've adopted is fairly self-evident. It can be anything almost. It could be welfare, not weapons. It could be NHS, not weapons. Wages is just a, alliteration to hang it on. But the key point is, what else could usefully the money wasted on armaments, including nuclear armaments, could be spent on. I'll just move this out of the way so you get that see that properly. Military spending is essentially exempt from what is now, I think, probably the third major round of austerity that's taking place. And there's a reason for that. And I think that explains the importance of opposing the rise in military spending, including on nuclear weaponry, for this country and for the world. And we're almost certainly going to see a further increase in that spending on Wednesday in the budget. We've had Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, talking about 3.2 billion extra that he needs just to plug the gap in current overspending on the military. And he's explicit that that's because of the bombing campaign in Yemen, which is, despite government denials, is part of the joint Western-Israeli effort, a war effort against the populations of the entire region. And because of Ukraine. And of course, we learnt from the leak by the German Air Force that Britain has troops on the ground in Ukraine. And I don't think anyone in this audience needs reminding that the combatant on the other side in this, Russia, also has nuclear weapons, like NATO has nuclear weapons, and extremely dangerous and extremely reckless and adventurous on the part of the British government. And as I say, it's exempt. Everything else is facing cuts, probably with the main exception of interest payments that go to fund managers, hedge funds, and the like, and the military. For them, there is a magic money tree. And just to confirm that, in my extremely wonky can't even call it handwriting. It's meant to be a loop, but you get the drift. The total in the final row is the key one to focus on. That's the, leave aside the jargon, total resource, departmental expenditure limits. It's the money the government spends, but not including the COVID bailout money. And what's happening with that from the last budget is it's falling even in nominal terms, that's current prices. That's before you take inflation into account, which, as we know, has been very high and remains historically high, recent history in any event. We have a growing population and we have an aging population, all those putting very big pressures on public spending. So the idea you can cut it even before taking inflation into account is really quite disastrous for what's going to happen to public services, even worse than we have now. The NHS waiting lists, more than 7 million, are schools, many of them unusable because of either of RAC or asbestos, and so on and so on. So that's what's happening in the parts of the economy, the public sector we cherish and we need: health, housing, education, so on. But the military is exempted from this. And one of the key myths, some of you may have seen this before, but I think it's worth repeating. One of the key myths is that we don't spend enough on the military in this country? Well, on one column there, and this data is from NATO, so it's a pretty unimpeachable source. In one column, we have British military spending in billions of dollars, over 69 billion. That's more than Germany, Belgium, Denmark, and the Czech Republic combined. And we shouldn't need to remind ourselves, but it's probably not too outlandish to do so, is that those countries are all a lot nearer Russia than this one. You would think that they would, if the purpose was to defend yourself against Russia, then you'd think that those countries might think that they had a greater need to do so than this one. It's not really about defense at all. It's about offense, which I'll come on to. But the idea that we have undersized military spending in this country is a joke in very bad taste, given what's happening to public services. Now, it's quite true that Britain has much lower military spending than the United States. There's two factors there. Is the US, one, is a much larger economy. It's about 8 times bigger than Britain. But two, it has gargantuan military spending. So military spending is about 13 times bigger in the US than in this country. And the US outspends all other countries combined. You have to start to get down to micro countries before it starts to level up. And the reason that it's important for the world that British military spending is curbed is because the British government and governments have historically acted as the recruiting sergeant and beating the drum for an increase in military spending by all of the NATO powers. Britain alone couldn't make much difference to the overall risks in the world, although we see with Yemen and Ukraine, it's certainly doing its best to do that, or its worst. But in its political role as the drum beater for the US's campaign to increase military spending across the board in the NATO countries, it plays a very important role. Sometimes that reaches farcical levels. I don't just mean how much whatever the US says, the British government parrots, but I mean in terms of operationally. So I'm sure everyone will know that now Trident has been tested twice and failed twice. In fact, it seems more of a danger to the submarines carrying Trident than it does to anything else. Well, that can't necessarily be expected to last. And it's an enormous amount of money. The pamphlet that was referred to at the beginning that I wrote in 2016 was 205 billion was the outlay we came to based on government sources. And we can't get an update from the government now, despite alleged transparency on this issue. But given inflation and inflation of military hardware and many other factors, it's bound to be significantly higher even than that 205 billion. It's not really operationally important, especially if, as we suspect, it's not operationally independent of the US at all, although that's denied by successive British governments. But it is important as far as Britain is concerned in the phrase they use of placing Britain at the top table, which really means as the most loyal, most subservient NATO power to the US and its recruiting sergeant for greater military spending. And that's a role Britain takes extremely seriously, despite the fact it's got a series of mishaps, misadventures, and basically shoddy planning, even in a military perspective. So we have the Trident missiles that flop into the water alongside the submarines. We have 2 aircraft carriers, which only carry US planes because Britain doesn't have the aircraft to warrant aircraft carriers. So it's really at the service of the US Air Force and Navy. And they don't seem to work. And then we have tanks that don't work. And this isn't an accident, I think. It's a pattern, which is basically this is all rushed out repeatedly in a shoddy way because Britain is so anxious to impress the US and to increase its spending as an example to the others, even if the spending turns out to be operationally useless, which is seemingly increasingly the case. Um, I'll come back to this chart because I want to say a few other things before I move on to it. I mentioned that SHAPS is looking to increase the military budget, that the Trident, the aircraft carriers, and the tanks don't work. So therefore, I want to emphasize it's a political role that Britain is playing, and that's twofold. One, it has a role internationally in drumming up support for increased military spending. But two, domestically, it has the terrible effect of diverting resources away from other areas of spending. And I want to deal quite quickly, quite briefly, towards the end of what I'm going to say, with some myths that we need to confront and address in order to develop our arguments, I think, and also to win the arguments. Now, the first is to note that this is a political role that Britain's playing, despite the guff from the generals and the Empire 2.0 people and all the rest of it. Britain is not ruling the waves. It's not Empire 2.0. It's really just a junior PR role, a campaign role that is playing on behalf of the US and NATO in general. It's also not important economically in the sense of it doesn't produce anything. When you have investment, the purpose of investment is to increase and augment what we used to call the means of production. It's still a very valid phrase in my view. And with the means of production, they mean you can produce more if you increase them, hence the importance of investment. But that's not the case with military spending at all. If I build a factory, which then I deploy lots of machine tools in it, then they can create tools which then go into production, whether it's cars, household goods, or whatever. If you do the same for military spending and increase capital outlays, investment there, you don't get anything. All you get is the means of destruction, not the means of production. That is all you can do with it. All you can do with a missile is fire it. All you can do with a bullet is fire it. All you can do with a gun is use it. And as a result, it doesn't have any positive economic impact whatsoever. And that then relates to a third key myth, which is that huge amounts of military spending are job creating. They're not. It's probably, in fact, almost certainly the least jobs rich type of spending you can do. When I wrote that pamphlet, what we found is that you could employ the 11,500 civilian workers related to the Trident program on average salaries for 500 years for the cost of the Trident program. It's just ridiculously not jobs rich. Unlike, for example, big spending, capital spending, and there's 205 billion to play with after all, in the NHS, in education, in the transport network, in housing, all these desperately needed and would create literally millions of jobs. When we moved out of COVID lockdowns, the level of investment went up a little bit, but what we had was eventually, very slowly, job creation of about 1.8 million, and nothing like the level of money that would be available from diverting it towards Trident. So it's really a myth which no one in the Labour movement, Labour Party or trade union should ever buy into, that this is a great way of creating jobs. It's just a nonsense. So then finally, I want to come back to this chart because I think it partly points to some of the arguments we can use as an alternative. Britain's military spending is outsized in NATO compared to the average. In fact, this calculation of what's called the Europe-Canada average military spending as a percent of GDP isn't my calculation. It's NATO's. It's how NATO does it. Because the US is so large an economy and spends so much more as a proportion of GDP than all the large countries of NATO, it removes the US from the calculations because it completely skews the average and has really the Europe-Canada, which is Britain's peer group. And this chart shows that the average of that spending is way below what Britain spends on the military. And my calculation is that that means there's about an extra 7 or 8 billion would be available, whether it's for schools or hospitals or transport or housing, whatever our political priorities are and what we want to argue for, would be available simply just by cutting back to the average of the EU and NATO countries as far as military spending is concerned. Of course, we could go further, and I certainly wouldn't be opposed to that. But that, I think, begins to point to where we need to go in terms of arguments about what Britain's actual spending is, what its relative size is to our peer group, not the US, and what the alternatives are. So just to summarise then, Britain has a hugely outsized military spending compared to its peer group. It's largely shoddy and misbegotten because it's so much in a rush to impress the US. It's a political role, not a vital military one, certainly not for NATO's defence, as the people of Yemen in particular could testify, and I would argue the people of Ukraine and Russia too. And we could spend that money very productively, especially on Trident, but the whole military budget very productively elsewhere. And that is what I think we should argue for in terms of Labour CND. And I'll stop there if that's okay.